Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly and I'm a mixed media artist who specializes in gouache paint, ink work, and sometimes I do digital painting. In this week's video, I'll be showing you the final details on this glowing mushroom fairy painting that I have finally completed. It has been a while, it has been a journey, but yeah, let's get into it. So, in my reference photo, which I can include here, there's a lot of moss all over the ground. These mushrooms are growing out of a log. Lots of moss going on in this situation, and as you can see in my painting, I blocked out all those weird abstract shapes because what is moss even? It's kind of like this carpet. Nature's carpet. So there's a lot of abstract, weird organic shapes. It's not something very geometric. There's a lot of blobs of light and shadow and a lot of kind of fuzzy texture. So I did my best to just block in the general shapes that I saw across the contours of the moss growing on the log. And now I'm using a damp brush and wiggling my brush back and forth to kind of push and pull the paint, and what this does is kind of blur and blend all the paint together and create that soft kind of carpety look. And I'm using very minimal water here. You don't want to use too much because what can happen is all the paint underneath can revive that I previously layered, and I want that to revive a tiny bit in order to blend, the paint, but I don't want it to be to the extent where I lift up so much of the paint that you see the illustration board in the background. Like, you don't want to make a bald spot in your painting. So what I do is I just dip my brush into water and then I blot it off on both sides on my paper towel or a rag on the side, and then use that damp brush as my feathering tool. Then after that, I'm going back in with a spring green shade of watercolor paint, and I have that mixed in with a little bit of white gouache paint to give higher opacity. It's just what I had at the time. If I had this shade in gouache paint, I would have just used that, but I'm just using what I have. I'm blocking that in areas where I know there's going to be a bunch of that glow hitting the moss. I'm also using that same mixture with a little bit more of that white gouache paint mixed in to create a little bit of a rim light in areas where those spirit orbs in the background are going to be illuminating the moss. What I'm doing here is I'm kind of feathering that in vertical directions across the contours of the moss, and this kind of accentuates the bumpy texture in the moss, and it also shows that it's got a little bit of like a fuzziness to it. Not only is there moss on this ground covering in the painting, but there's also lichen, which is similar to moss, but it's also similar to fungus. I discovered this once I did a scientific illustration commission recently, that it's considered a plant and a fungus. I don't know. The world's a crazy place. But that's the stuff that's lifting up around the mushroom. So you see more of that fuzzy stuff in the background, that's moss, okay? And then the areas where there's more of like flakiness, you see more ruffles and layers to it, that's lichen. I created more contrast in the lichen by adding more of that spring green shade I mixed earlier and getting more specific and detailed with where the glowing from the mushroom is going to be highlighting it. And then I also mixed together some ivory black and Prussian blue to create a desaturated bluish shadow. And I'm applying that in areas where there's going to be a core shadow, also a cast shadow. So I applied that in areas where the moss in the background is being backlit. I want the core shadow to be closer to the viewer because it's being backlit. And then I also applied it in drop shadowed areas from the lichen, especially in areas where it's getting direct light from that glowing mushroom. Using a damp brush, like I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of making a swirling formation to diffuse the edges of those glowing orbs in the background. I will be applying more of that white and green mixture and creating more of a pigmented center to them. This is just going to be the base of them, and then I'll be building up that color more pigmented towards the center, and this is going to create more of that spirit orb, almost like it's out of focus in the background. That's what I want. So I just blurred that, and then later on I'm going to apply more of that color in the center for more pigmentation. I'm also working on some of the highlights and shadows around this mushroom that the fairy is sitting on. I'm also touching up some of the core shadows across her feet and legs from those glowing mushrooms as well. Here I'm revising the glowing highlights across the fairy. I'm applying some of that spring green color with a little bit of that titanium white gouache paint mixed in, and I'm applying that in areas where there's going to be a lot more of that light, especially in areas like her knees, the side of her shin on her right leg, and then in front of her shin on her left leg, as well as a very thin rim light on her leg underneath it, getting a little bit of that glow from the mushroom she's sitting on. I'm also applying this rim light effect using a nail brush, which is very, very thin to create very precise pinstriping. And I'm applying that across the rim of the mushroom to the right. And I'm doing the same thing to the mushroom that she's sitting on. What this does is it kind of shows that the mushroom cap is a little bit wrinkled and curling in underneath itself, so it will be getting some of that rim light from the glow underneath hitting the edges there. The areas across her shoulder and chest are going to get a lot of that lighting because her head is a glowing mushroom as well, so it's literally like as if you have a lamp on your head and you're going to get direct light right there. So I made sure that her shoulders and chest got the most light because of where that mushroom is located, and then her arms are still getting some of that lighting, but it's not going to be as intense. The light is going to diffuse outwards. With that shadow mixture of ivory black and Prussian blue, I'm applying this in areas across her fairy wings as well as on the side of her gown to create not just a core shadow but also the sense of transparency in her fairy wings, because areas that are going to be lit up are going to show reflection from the glowing mushroom. Think of her wings like glass. They're going to be transparent. And areas that are going to be dark, like the background, are going to be areas that are not just shaded, but actually show the background because they're see-through. So I'm just creating this general form to them and shading them as if they're glass. I did the same thing to the spider webs and the water droplets on them. I incorporated a thinner coating of the background color because they're going to be transparent and then just going to have a lot of white used to highlight them. I did more of a transparent version of that color though because the spider webs and droplets are very tiny and detailed and I still need to know where they are, so that's why I kept that layer so transparent.
Well, whatever it is, pray that it never hits you.
I've got a feeling love don't have to be the way you say it is.
Well, it's gotta be that way with me. Because I've only loved one man. And I've got a hunch I'm never going to feel no other kind of love.
Okay, this is the fun part where I get a very pigmented version of that glowing color, that kind of lime green color, and I'm doing a lot of fine detail work here. This is where I'm adding the high points of highlights across the lichen as well as the moss, and I'm also incorporating that color into the core center of the spirit orbs in the background, which create this diffused out of focus look. And I'm also using the same color as the highlights on the spider webs and dewdrops, especially the closer they are to a glowing mushroom. So specifically this spider web area in the lower left region of the painting, that's going to get a lot more of that color from that mushroom right next to it, as well as those spirit orbs that are right next to it. With my nail brush, which is very good for pinstriping, very fine lines, I'm doing the edges of the fairy wings with that lime green kind of color, and in areas where it's going to be outlining a larger section of the wings, I'm doing a thicker line, and then in areas where I want there to be some veins within the wings, I'm using a lot less pressure to create finer lines. For the spider web up above, I am still using some of that lime green color, but I'm using a lot more white mixed in because it is located above the mushrooms. A lot more of that glowing effect is happening underneath the mushrooms, so they're not going to get a ton of that color hitting them. I wound up naming this painting Portal, and that's because of the technique I used when creating this. So the composition I used is that anything inside the oval is going to be done in gouache, and it's going to be in full color, and anything that goes outside of the oval frame is going to be illustrated using just ink. So outside is going to be a different medium than inside, and I like doing this because I think things like fairies have this very mystical quality to them, and the idea is using two different mediums to describe two different dimensions fusing together. It was very difficult using ballpoint ink to illustrate lichen and moss because, again, it's a very abstract shape, and trying to describe such an organic abstract shape can be very annoying. I like high contrast, and I like knowing exactly what it is I'm looking at so I can draw it. So yeah, that was a little annoying, but I just tried my best by outlining very lightly some squiggly lines for the lichen and moss, and using the reference photo I photoshopped together, trying to just focus on the darkest darks first and then lightening up those areas where it's getting more of the glowing light from the mushroom. While I'm doing this, I'm using a cross-hatching technique, but I like to do it in multiple directions, and this gives the effect that it's kind of airbrushed or smooth. It has less obvious lines shading the subject. It just looks a lot softer. For the spider webs, I try to create my lines thicker in areas where I know the spider web is coming to a joint, and then I flick the line outwards and away to create a taper to it, and this kind of gives a subtle highlight effect even though I'm just drawing a line. For the dewdrops, I like to do a circular motion, kind of spiraling inwards on the dewdrop, and this creates a very subtle shadow and highlight effect to the water droplets. And then for this edge of the wing, I just shaded it like I normally would, going with the contours of the edge of the wing, and I kept the inside of the wing see-through. I didn't think there was any point in shading that area, to be honest. This piece is finally done and it's listed on my website. I will have that linked down below. I have postcard prints, 8x10 inch prints, as well as 16x20 inch prints available for purchase. I hope you guys liked this week's video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I will see you next week. Bye!